Welcome back to Text Catheter, everybody. I'm your host, your only host, because there is no co-host. Jason has been text communicated from Text Catheter, and that basically means he's no longer allowed on the show. He keeps abandoning us to hang out with this family that he's got, and I'm like, I'm your family. What are you doing? He keeps wanting to hang out with this girl he calls his wife, and I'm like, shh, come on, bro. No girls allowed, man.
Is that what he calls avoiding Babylon?
Yeah, that's what he calls. Hey, I'd let Jason stick up for himself, but he's not here. So
exactly. He lost that ability of his own volition.
So we're going to talk about Blessed Charles of Austria. This is okay. So here's why I like this topic. First of all, I'm new to this devotion of this particular saint. You guys have a lot more experience with Blessed Charles, but lately I've been thinking a lot about the First World War. I've been listening to like a lot of lectures online from the U.S. World War I Memorial and Museum. Has got some amazing, just like 1 hour talks on YouTube if you ever want to get into listen to that stuff. But I'm thinking a lot about the First World War and the tragedy that unfolded from 1914 to 1918. Blessed Charles of Austria will play. He's sort of a lone voice of reason in an age of absolute madness, and I kind of sense that we're in an age of madness right now where voices of reason we're not really listening to those people. Those people are kind of a downer, and they don't really let us participate in our collective fantasies and things like that. So what a great topic to talk about. But before we do that, we do have a tradition on Text Catheter where we pray real quick. We're going to say a quick prayer to the Holy Ghost. Please join along with us, and hope that we have a fruitful and edifying discussion with our guests, Connor and Trevor from Tridentine Brewing, who I totally didn't introduce. I just started talking, and that was rude. I'll give you guys an introduction and a plug here in just a minute. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancti Spiritus, repletur corda fidelium, et tui amoris in eis ignima accende. Imiditi spiritum tuum et creabuntur, et renovabis faciam terre. Oremus. Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione docuisti, da nobis in iodum spiritu recta sapere, et de eos semper consolatione gadere, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Connor, you guys know Connor from Plotlines. If you don't know Plotlines, you need to get over there and subscribe to that channel immediately. Connor is my brother from another mother, my wartime consigliere, fellow Irishman from up the Illinois way. Trevor is the boss over there. Well, he's not the boss. His dad's the boss, actually, at Tridentine Brewing. And we've had him on the show before, but it's been a long time. Both these guys are certified friends of the show. Connor, Trevor, welcome to Text Catheter, and it's great to have you guys.
Oh, thanks for having me. I don't actually think I've been on the show. I think
you've been on the show.
I don't think so. Somebody, leave a comment and whether or not you've seen me on the show. But I mean, we've been on shows together, but you've been on my show a bunch of times. But I don't actually think I've been on your show. Your co-host keeps disappearing.
Yeah, he's good like that, isn't he?
I've been on both shows, so
you have been on
happy
both
to
shows.
Say. It's been a while since I've been on here on Text Cathedra, but I've been on Connor's show a couple times. So great to be back with both of you at the same time.
And we've got some exciting things going on in Tridentine Brewing that we're going to talk about since the last time that we've talked. And so I can't wait to get into that. But the topic of tonight's talk is our buddy here, Charles I of Austria. Now, I know that over at Tridentine Brewing, you guys have named a couple of beers after Princess Zita and Blessed Charles of Austria. Am I correct about that?
That's right, Mark. Yeah, we got our Carl beer, which is called Hopsburg, that you can see here. Right. That's our Vienna lager. And then I don't have it with me here, but it is our impressive Imperial Red Ale, which is for Empress Zita. So yeah, we've got two beers in honor of both of them.
Now, for those of you who don't know, Charles I of Austria inherited the throne of the Habsburg, the throne of Austria-Hungary after the death of Franz Joseph I, right in the middle of the First World War. Now, the First World War, for the United States, for the Americans, it's kind of the forgotten war, and it's kind of seen as like the easy war, because we didn't really. I mean, I think we lost something like a couple of 100,000 men in that war, so it's not a nothing, but it doesn't compare to the millions of casualties that the Europeans suffered in that war: French, German, English. And what was surprising to me about that war was the stalemate of it, and the willingness of all the alliances to continue fighting regardless of how many men it was going to kill. And it seemed like the objective of the war was to continue the war. It wasn't really to win anything, and we just have to keep fighting because the war demands it.
Prestige,
right?
Prestige.
What do you mean by prestige? Go on.
It's a national. It would be a national disgrace to lose it. That's one of the reasons why it went on for so long, because by that time things had become not so much about land, though that was important, but for most of the people, it was, a nationalism was guiding foreign policy in the way that it basically said we have to show that we are better than everybody else in order to win this war. And also, I would say we, as Americans, we basically got a participation ribbon.
Sure.
Like that's basically the best way to describe our outcome or our participation. We just got a ribbon. We didn't actually, we didn't get any medals for winning or anything like that, though Wilson had a big part in dictating the Peace of Versailles, which we'll probably get into.
Now, I've actually been fortunate enough. I've stood at the corner in Sarajevo where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. And you would think that there would be a monument there or a plaque or something. There's nothing there.
Well, I mean, it's in Bosnia. Why? Like, they're not going to care about an Austrian Archduke.
Yeah. And that's something that I want to get into too, is the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because it's the weirdest little empire. It's nothing like the other imperial presences in Europe at that time. It's so different, and its differences, I think, I'd love to get you guys' take on it, because it seems to be this simultaneously its greatest strength and its greatest weakness at the same time is its multi-ethnicity and its dual nature. It's both Austrian and Hungarian, and it's both European and Slavic, and it's got an imperial structure too that is that's I don't know, it's kind of its own animal. It's nothing else like it in Europe, and it's interesting because that empire and something happening to it sort of starts the war, but then they sort of become like a non-factor in the fighting, at least from my brief knowledge of it. Is that you guys' understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in regards to the war, I mean, over time, when you had, first of all, they were more of a junior partner with Germany,
right,
in the war, in that particular alliance, and Germany came more to the fore. But yeah, Austria did almost become a little bit stuck because of Italy joining the war. So with Italy joining the war, Austria is fighting on two fronts. And because America, I mean, with our American history, our American lens, we always think of the Western Front. We think of in France, the fighting mainly, because that's where American soldiers were. But with Italy joining, Italy was actually allied with Austria and Germany, which would happen in World War II again. But Italy actually broke off because they were secretly offered some land, Austrian land, if they were to fight against the Austrians. So they switched sides early on in the conflict.
Mm.
That really tied up a lot of Austria's resources, so that they're fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front and what is now Ukraine, and of course the Italians in the Alps. So it really tied them up, and became more of a non-factor for us. But I will also say, in regards to the empire, it really was a successor to the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, it really was a Holy Roman Empire. I know they changed the name,
Yeah.
but that's more of a technicality in many ways. And so that particular empire was really built more on marriage and family versus conquest, like we see with some of the other empires, like with Germany. Germany was a creation of Bismarck more than anything else, and raw imperial might and the militarism involved with that, whereas Austria-Hungary wasn't. It was really marriages and building it more organically, acquiring land. And so you're right. It is an interesting amount of territory and the peoples that it brought together, which, to your point, Mark, I think it definitely did contribute to some of the strife, the different peoples. And maybe we could talk about this in a little while, I guess, how Karl tied in, how Franz Ferdinand tied in, how they were going to change the empire a bit, how they proposed to do so. They never really came to fruition. That probably would have eased a lot of the tensions. But yeah, it wasn't as nationalistic, right? Because it had all these people in it. It wasn't, one united, German people or Slavic people. They all had to come together to work together. So it wasn't quite the same nationalist fervor that Connor was talking about, at least in that particular empire. Anyway, sorry, go ahead, Connor.
Yeah. So I'd like to just say a few things about that. I would say it's actually 3 fronts, not just 2, because there wasn't just an Eastern Front in Russia. There was also Serbia, and that took a good while, and then Italy in the south, and then Russia in the east. So basically, the structure of Austria-Hungary is that it's vulnerable from a geographical standpoint, especially in this type of war. So fighting 3 fronts is incredibly difficult. And I don't think you could say that they were junior partners right off the bat. I think that came over time that happened. And as basically the German military became more dominant than the Kaiser in Germany, it became more of a, sort of a junior partner status. Because when you have 2 emperors and they're basically leading things, they have a lot of respect for each other's office or throne, or that type of thing. But when you have these military or these generals that are basically in charge of most of the decision making in Germany, which is what happens, is basically the Kaiser is completely ignored for a long stretch of time. Basically, the attitude between Germans and the Austro-Hungarian army becomes, you guys are lesser, and we're going to make the dominant decisions. And also, when it comes to sort of Franz Ferdinand, I guess what I said about Bosnia not having any a statue or a plaque or something commemorating his death, as you said, it's actually, I imagine the politicians of Bosnia don't want something like that. But actually, Franz Ferdinand was very popular amongst the Slavs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then when you think of Austria-Hungary, we have to think of it as 2 different states, 2 different countries, basically. You have the Kingdom of Kingdom of Hungary, and you have the Empire of Austria, which is basically part of Slovenia, all of Austria, what is now Czechia, and southern Poland. So that is basically what the Empire of Austria looks like. And that, you could say, I think, is a remnant of the Holy Roman Empire. But the Kingdom of Hungary is by no stretch the a successor to the Holy Roman Empire. It is of its own entity, and that's why there's this difference in tension between the Hungarian kingdom and the Austrian Empire. And that basically sets it up where it's ready for collapse. It's always been an interesting thing to me because I've studied the Habsburgs from basically their beginning until their fall, and it always really confused me how something like this empire that you see in the map of World War I, how it just dissolves utterly so quickly at the end. And it really is the fact that basically these entities only have a shared military, that is and shared monarch, and that's all they have in common, basically. Other
I know
than
that. Yeah, that was always Hitler's complaint about the Austria-Hungarian Empire. He was born into the Austria-Hungarian Empire, obviously, serves in the German army, develops his racialized theory of the nation based on what he considered to be the failures of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And his whole thing is saying, look, this is what a state with multi-ethnic ethnicities and things like that all trying to work together, this is what it produces, just catastrophe. Therefore, if you want to have a true Reich, one people, one folk, one Fuhrer, and everybody's got to be the same, that's how you determine who's really a part of the nation, is who's a part of the race. He develops this sort of theory based on his experiences or his perception, I should say, of the failures of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But one of the things that you're bringing up, Connor, and I think this is a great introduction to Blessed Karl, is this is the world that Blessed Karl is sort of, he comes to maturity in this very complicated European landscape of empires that are in many ways allied with one another, but the alliances can be tenuous at times. The politics are different than what we grew up in the post World War II age, where Europe is basically run by a consensus of economic experts to ensure that wars don't happen anymore. We can talk about whether that was a good idea or not on a different show, I suppose. But I get the sense that Karl is unique amongst the Habsburgs of his day, at least, in that while I'm sure the Habsburgs, and Connor, you could probably tell me this better than anybody, are Catholic, Karl seems to be unique in his piety and his devoutness and his devotion to the faith. Would you say that that's correct?
Well, I'd say there tends to be always a handful of Habsburgs that are quite devout, and then there tend to be a handful that aren't, though they always give lip service. That's one thing they tend to do. I mean, his mother was very devout, so he very much got his religion from his mother, and he got his charisma from his father. His father was the complete opposite. His father was Trevor, what's the right word?
An adulterer.
Oh, there you go. Philanderer.
Yeah, he was notorious. Let's put it that way. His father ended up dying of syphilis, so that tells you kind of what his father was up to.
He followed in the tradition of Henry VIII there.
Yeah. Which no, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, because it's something I was recently brought to my attention. I think it was something that Charles Coulomb brought up at a recent conference that I was at in Clear Creek for Empress Zita. And usually we think of Blessed Karl as, well, I do, but most people will think of Blessed Karl as an excellent father, an excellent husband, and a leader, political leader. And that's kind of where the main devotions are. But he also brought up the fact that he's also a great model for people that grow up in broken homes, actually, because that's exactly what he grew up in. Because while his parents never got a divorce or anything, I think fairly early on they ended up having to separate because of his father's ways. His mother couldn't be around that and have Carl around that. But Carl still loved his father. He still, would visit his father. He was there with him, would visit him in the hospital while he was dying and everything. So Carl never had any, hatred for his father, even though his father made things, very difficult on him and his mother. So that's just something to think about as well. And something I was, God bless me, I didn't have to endure anything like that in my own childhood. But I think for people and quite a few people do grow up in difficult situations.
I definitely did. Yeah.
So that's just something to think about as well, that Carl's a really good, role model or saint to pray for. I know he's not a saint yet, but blessed to pray to, for help when struggling through situations like that.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think, there's a lot of pop psychology out there that you're basically going to be exactly like your parents. You're sort of that, a human being is just an amalgamation of his exterior forces around him. But at the end of the day, I really do believe that it comes down to a personal choice to turn away from sin or to steer into the skid, as they say. And this is a great example of a person who, let's face it, being royalty at that time in that place, there was probably no shortage of opportunities to embrace evil, okay, in all of the ways that Satan loves to offer that. And yet, in spite of that, and it's interesting, we're recording this today on the feast of St. Louis, King of France. There are examples in the Christian church, in the Catholic Church, of monarchs or men of extreme who may have had a lot of wealth or political and worldly power, who, in spite of that, embrace Christ, turn away from sin, and devote themselves to leading lives of holiness and piety. We're talking about how Carl will inherit the throne. His father will die in 1917 or 18.
No, his father dies much earlier.
1906, I thought it was.
His grand uncle is the one that dies.
Right. Okay, that's
he
right.
Inherits the throne from it's either 1917 or 1918.
Yeah, so it's right towards the end of the war. And by this time, obviously, World War I. And it's funny because from the days of the July crisis of 1914, the common consensus seems to be this is going to be a pretty short affair. It's going to be short, it's going to be decisive, and it's going to be the war to end all wars. By 1917, at least, for sure by 1918, I don't think Europe had even remotely prepared for the carnage that would ensue. And here comes Karl I of Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as you can say, the sort of lead allies with Germany. And he's looking for peace, and he's actively working for a peaceful solution to the war. Connor, can you speak a little more on the details of that? I'm new to this devotion, and I'm glad that you've done a little bit more research on this than I have.
So peace regarding specifically, or what?
His efforts in trying to either, I get the sense that these were backdoor channels that he's sort of exploring peace with, but I don't know specifically how he's doing that.
So so there's two things. There's a front door that he explores, and that's Benedict the 15th, I think. Benedict the 15th proposes, or basically pushes for peace amongst all the leaders, and Blessed Charles is the only leader to support Benedict the 15th's call for peace and his attempts at peace. And then his other attempt at peace is through the French, and specifically through his brother-in-law, brother-in-laws, I think two of them, but Prince Sixtus of Bourbon Parma, which is his wife Zita's brother, is I think he originally is a member of the Belgian army because as a royal he is not permitted by French law to be in the French military.
Right.
But he sort of during the time, so the French Republic is a bit chaotic. So in the beginning of the war, I believe there's a very anti-Austro-Hungarian regime in France. And then in the middle of the war, the prime minister or president or what have you changes, and it's a little bit of a more friendly leader in charge of France. And basically he connects via Sixtus, Prince Sixtus, basically in negotiations of how to make peace separate from Germany, because Germany is not interested in making peace at this time. I mean, one of the things is like whenever the Central Powers are interested in making peace, the Allies aren't, and whenever the Allies are interested in making peace, for the most part, the Germany is not. So Sixtus basically communicates with both the British and the French, but the French and the British can't make an agreement because they made a deal that they won't make peace without Italy's consent, and Italy won't give consent unless they hand over territory. And it becomes known as, I believe, the Sixtus Affair when it comes out, and it's a whole debacle for everyone. And I believe the French government falls apart as well. It gets handed back to a more hostile party, and that basically is the closing of what would be a peace that might have lasted.
Well, so then in 1918, the powers are able to reach an agreement at Versailles. An agreement is a little bit of a the victors make an agreement. That's what I meant. Yeah. The victors. And I've always kind of in my mind thought of Austria-Hungary's main rival in this weird political sphere, the Ottoman Empire. Do you think that that's a fair statement?
It's odd.
Its main sort of political rival in that sphere would be like the Ottomans. I don't know if that's probably true or not, but
the Ottomans aren't. It's complicated because once Austria made an enemy out of Russia in the what I can't remember what the year was, during the Crimean War, when Austria made an enemy out of Russia in the Crimean War, it basically made it impossible for Austria to get back on the Russians' good side. So, and the only ally and the best ally in that situation is the Ottomans. So by default, it's by default.
Okay.
It's not really out of so is it odd? It's a little odd, but when the Ottoman Empire is basically a walking corpse at this point. It's not a threat to anybody. It's just ready for collapse at any point.
Yeah. And at Versailles, one of the so here's my question, because I know that one of the things that will happen as the abolishment of the Habsburg throne, however, unlike Nicholas II in Russia, Karl never abdicates. But his abdication is it's not de jure, but it's de facto, right? Can you explain the process of how he loses the throne and then what happens to him in the years following the close of the war? Because I'm a little unclear on exactly what that story is. Either Trevor, are you familiar with this history?
Yeah, Mark. So when Carl was basically forced, when he was forced really before even Versailles to really, de facto, as you said, abdicate. He never abdicated. He made that clear. But the fact that he renounced active participation in the government, the day-to-day of the government, is what he wrote down. But he did specifically say, I'm not renouncing the throne. And basically with a clause, I can come back whenever I want. I just,
Okay.
I'm leaving. I'm forced to. Vienna had basically fallen. The Republic had been declared. And so that's really what happened in that case. And so, yeah, as a part of all that happening, and the British basically were able to, well, they escorted him out. So the Republic as well wanted the Habsburgs gone. So the British were able to help him escape or get over to Switzerland. I don't know, Connor, did I get all that right? I don't know if the British were involved initially.
So I'll just give a few more details and give a little bit of scope what's going on. So just an FYI regarding the complications with the Russians as well. Nicholas, one of the problems with Nicholas was he sort of would have liked to abdicate earlier, and but he would have liked to abdicate to his brother or cousin or something like that, but his cousin wouldn't allow or wouldn't accept it unless basically he was elected or approved by the Russian people or some way, which was not going to work. Basically, that was the collapse of Russia. But the reason Nicholas was so hesitant on abdicating was because his son, nobody knew this, but he was a hemophiliac, and the fear was he would get, it would be the death of him, which ironically is it's the death of him no matter what. His whole family is murdered by the Soviets anyways. There's no question about that. Anyways, so that's just the stage. The Romanovs are murdered, and that's in this 1917. That's before the war comes to an end. And then Versailles is more about Germany. That's more of the focus of Versailles. And basically they say you have the Kaiser, the German Kaiser has to go. The German Kaiser goes. But with Austria, there's a lot more chaos going on. There are, sort of the Austro-Hungarian military has collapsed. Hungary has basically declared itself independent. I think it's actually, I believe Edward Habsburg's ancestor, his I don't know if it's great grandfather, something like that, basically can't hold things together because he's basically the representative of the royal family in Hungary. I can't remember if he sort of lets things go, on purpose of some sort, or he can't control things anymore. But basically the Hungarians want out. But the Hungarians also go into basically a separate war, where they're fighting both the new Slovaks, and then they're also fighting Czechoslovakia. They're fighting the Romanians, and they're fighting the Serbs, and I think they're fighting Yugoslavia at the same time. So basically in this collapse, there's all of these countries are getting made through blood, basically, because there's also this treaty, and then that ends with the Treaty of Trianon, which basically shrinks Hungary into a preposterous size that's basically an insult. It's an insult to Hungary. Hungary becomes almost what it is today. I think it might, about what it is today. It becomes incredibly small. A lot of Hungarians actually live outside of Hungary, even though supposedly the point of Woodrow Wilson is basically all the nationalities will get their own state, even though a sizable amount of Hungarians are living outside of Hungary and are minorities in a bunch of different states outside. And then there is only one remaining field marshal in the out in he's I think he's a Serb. He's a Serb, which is interesting. So you have some Serbs that are in Austria, and you have some Serbs fighting against Austria from Serbia. And there's a funny little situation during the war where it's basically they yell out, basically the Serbs say, we are Serbians, we will never surrender, and then the Austrian Serbians yell back, we are Serbians, we will never surrender.
Oh man,
it's just like the ridiculous of it is just ridiculousness of it is hilarious. But this Serbian field marshal basically sends a communique to the emperor in Vienna and basically says, I have an army. If you tell me to, I will come back and put things right in Vienna, because Vienna is basically in the middle of a semi-revolution by the socialists.
Mm-hmm.
The socialists are basically taking over in Vienna, and that's what you get. Eventually, a socialist government comes to power in Vienna. And what Trevor was talking about the British helping out. So in order for not the same thing to happen to Emperor Nicholas or Tsar Nicholas, George the Fifth sends a Colonel Strutt, I think his name is. He is. Did you say this, Trevor?
I didn't say his name. No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I didn't add any of the details, and it's a good story.
Colonel Strutt is basically sent from England. He is a Catholic, interesting enough as well. Okay. So you have an English Catholic who I think who's sort of an adventurer, kind of. I think he might have been in Africa or stuff like that on adventures and stuff like that. So he's kind of this this stereotypical English adventurer, which is really interesting because it's cool to have a story where this all connects. But Colonel Strutt arrives in Austria, and also not to mention, his job is to get Blessed Karl out of Austria with his head still on his head. And not to mention, back up a little bit, the reason Austria and Hungary give up their monarch is because the United States basically says, and the Allies in general says, we'd rather you starve than allow the Habsburgs to still remain on the throne. So they were threatening to blockade and basically starve the population unless the Habsburgs were to be gone.
And is this because of World War I, or what is the specific beef with the Habsburgs in particular that leads to that? I mean, that seems like a pretty extreme.
It's probably Wilson, right, Connor?
Yeah,
Wilson's points.
Wilson believes all ethnicities need to have their own country.
Yeah.
So Austria-Hungary is basically an abomination, according to him.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's a successful multi-ethnic state, and I mean it is successful because the only thing that is unsuccessful is it in war. I don't think we look at states and just purely look at, okay, did they get conquered? Does that make it a successful state? Or do we look at peacetime and say, okay, how was it for the people? What were their principles? what were their goals? What were they an ordered society? I would say you have a much greater ordered society than you would in many other places. But
that's a good point.
But people look at it and be like, okay, they lost these wars. Because the thing is, with Austria-Hungary, the military for Austria-Hungary and the Austrians, the Habsburgs, have never viewed war as a way of conquering your enemies. That has never been the motive of war with Austria-Hungary or with the Habsburgs. The motive has always been to just maintain the family, the maintenance of the family and their peoples. That is the pure motivation of Austria-Hungary. That I mean, there might be some moments when you probably could point to that maybe are inconsistent, but when you can point, but you know, that basically proves the rule, you know.
Sure.
And then, so basically, Wilson wants this. Wilson wants Hungary to be its own thing. It wants Austria to be its own thing, because from what I can tell, if Austria had retained its Habsburg monarchy, so would Hungary. And then if Hungary had, then probably so would Czechoslovakia. And if Czechoslovakia would have, Croatia probably wouldn't have broken off. Basically, the whole thing wouldn't have collapsed if there wasn't this this fear or this threat of starvation.
Yeah, and I think also Wilson has got this very American view of democracy as the cure for everything. If you give people free and fair elections and give them assemblies in which they can elect representatives, then basically all of Europe will be like the United States. And I mean, this is sort of the problem we ran into in Iraq in 2003, right? We can just bring democracy to people who've never had it before. That's not part of their political tradition, and that will ensure that wars don't happen anymore. And unfortunately, I would argue that this philosophy would lead to a war 20 years later that would be even more destructive and lead to ideologies that were even worse and more destructive than imperialism. So anyway,
what you're describing is perfectly summed up in this story about Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt visited Vienna on one of his trips. I don't remember if it was as president or just as, you know, an ambassador, or just because he could. And he visited Franz Josef, Blessed Charles's predecessor. And he looked around and he was really confused because he didn't understand monarchy, and he didn't understand what an emperor does. So he basically asked, like, what is your purpose? What are you here for? Like, what are you even doing? And Franz Josef responded with, to protect my people from their politicians. Yeah,
fair point. Yeah.
So, but back to Colonel Strutt. Colonel Strutt comes down, and he basically he has to work with the new prime minister, Karl Renner, who basically betrayed Blessed Charles in order to become the new prime minister of this new German. It's actually interesting. It's the German Republic of Austria. That's what it's called.
Okay.
And that's what it was until basically the Anschluss.
Wait, what was his name again?
Karl Renner.
Oh, so, that's eerily similar to a modernist theologian whose name was Karl Rahner, who was similarly a snake. But anyway,
different kind of German.
Yeah.
But anyways, and also it's funny, you know, Karl's the same name, so it's basically Charles Renner. You know, it's the same. They have the same name, so it's just that's kind of funny. But anyways, he's his Judas basically. So Renner is the ultimate snake because he betrayed his country in order to become prime minister, Then he betrayed his country to the Nazis, and then he betrayed his country to the communists in order to become president.
Yeah.
And now he has there's statues of Renner in Austria.
Yeah, how apropos, right? I mean,
he's the ultimate traitor of the 1900s. He actually, the Nazis didn't even trust him. Like the Nazis, or he tried to betray, or he did betray, but he tried to hand himself over as like some use of the Nazis, and the Nazis were like, yeah, I don't think so. You're not trustworthy enough for this. Like, we don't want you.
Yeah.
But for the communists, that's a different story. Anyway, so Renner basically wants to force Blessed Charles into abdicating, and Blessed Charles will not abdicate, and Colonel Strutt basically has no power anyways. Like, he has no real authority. He's just kind of there as an emissary of the British.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically walks into the office of Renner and is carrying around I think it's a telegram or an order of some sort. And he's basically, he basically tells Renner, you need to release Emperor Charles at once so he can leave, and he will be given proper farewell, or the blockade will resume and you will not have food. And Colonel Strutt has no power to do this. He's carrying around nothing. He doesn't have any authority to do this, but Renner, being a pathetic man, just caves. He basically, says fine, he can leave. And then Blessed Charles leaves on a train from Austria to Switzerland, and that's where he stays until he visits Hungary once, and then tries to restore his kingdom a second time, where he is again betrayed by another supposed loyal leader, and then he ends up in Madeira, where he dies his
Portugal
martyrdom.
Is that Portugal? Is that right? Or
yeah, Madeira is an island in the middle of, or not in the middle, the eastern part of the Atlantic. It's not that close to Portugal, but it is part of Portugal.
Okay. And he will live